For more on this, we're joined by Francesco Rizzuto, who's a Professor of European Law at Liverpool John Moores University. Welcome back to the programme. Now, what would a 10-year phase-out actually look like for North America?
Well, for the next 10 years, what we have is political posturing by the United States. What it will actually look like is America, the United States, putting pressure on bilateral pressure. So we won't meet to discuss things altogether. What this means is that the United States will try and exert pressure on Mexico in particular, though Canada for steel also that you mentioned. So it will try and basically force these economies that either rely on exports to the United States, for example, Canadian steel, or motor vehicles that were built in Mexico because the costs are much lower in Mexico, that would then be exported to the United States. So what America is trying to do in all of this is to pressure its North American trading partners, but partners elsewhere, to relocate to the United States, basically. And really, they don't care much for what happens in Canada or Mexico. And this is basically economic nationalism of the worst kind. So, of course, it creates uncertainty if you're an investor in the long term. Over the next 10 years, things are going to be unstable. But remember, Trump won't be there in 10 years. So if you like, this is the politics of nationalist symbolism. But of course, if you are a corporate investor and you're building your motor cars and you're relying on imports of what was relatively economically viable steel from Canada, and that disappears, well, if you're an American producer or consumer, not good news for you, really.
So will these higher tariffs,
that it is.
Right, so will these higher tariffs actually bring back manufacturing jobs to the United States, as Trump so claims?
This is a bit of a myth. There are two fundamental developments going on in the world of manufacturing. One, the use of artificial intelligence. Two, the use of mechanization, if you like, robotics. We don't need as many workers to produce the same kind of things. So whilst without a doubt, some companies will try and get around the tariffs and the barriers that Trump is erecting by relocating. We've seen this in Europe as well, where Stellantis, for example, and others are going to invest in America and so on to get around it. But that will not necessarily create more jobs in America, because inviting production back to America is fine, but actually we can see that the aggregate figures on American employment have not suddenly taken off. So it's, you know, it's not so smart, though you might argue if they produce these things in America, that will dampen the potential for inflation to rise, because, of course, there'll be no tariffs on goods that are produced in the United States. Though, of course, we've seen the consequences of economic warfare in Germany, as an example, without going to Canada. And Canadian steel is really going to find it difficult to survive, steel production and steel employment. We've seen in Germany, Volkswagen, BMW and so on, laying off tens of thousands of workers. That's not just competition from China, but it's also tariffs to the United States that are not exactly and completely offset by moving production to the United States or increasing production to the United States. So the impact, the disruptive impact on the world economy, supply chains and so on, of what Trump is doing are really phenomenal. And if you're a corporate investor or if you're a producer, you're really trying to navigate through a storm, really, of unpredictability.
And looking at Canada, those tariffs of 50% are incredibly high. Will exporters be able to absorb that without having to cut production, or will they be able to potentially find other markets?
Well, how can you find other markets? 90% of Canadian steel goes to the United States. You might be able to reduce costs, freight costs and so on, the way the Canadian government is trying to do, but it's going to take an eternity to offset, if you like, a loss of 90% of your market. 90%. Oh, it's really incredible. No, it's not. I mean, production will in time go down. Apparently, it's already down by 15%. Or something. The Canadian steel industry simply cannot absorb this. And remember, there is a glut of steel production in the world. It's not so much the Europeans, but generally. So the poor Canadians have really been dealt, or the steel industry, steel production in Canada, are being dealt with a potentially mortal blow, and they really will have to downsize. Where are they going to find these markets? Will they be able to compete in terms of cost with steel produced in other parts of the world? Highly unlikely, it seems to me.
Professor Francesco Rizzuto, always great to speak to you. Thank you.